Good afternoon. My name is Jim Nitterauer. I am Director of Information Security from Graylog. I hope you can hear me. And this talk is entitled Extortion, Chaos, and Needless Busywork, aka Vendor Risk Management. So how many? Sure. Russell's going to interrupt. I just got to take a photo for all right. Cool. All right, now we've got all the formalities out of the way. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about a little bit who am I, what is vendor risk management, kind of give you a brief overview of what that is. Why did I decide to do this talk, other than the fact that Russell begged me to do it and said it was going to be the best one here, and I don't believe that for a minute. He was just trying to sweet talk me. What are the framework requirements? Why do we even do vendor risk management in the first place? We're going to talk about some real-world stories from my current position and a former position. We're going to talk about what really matters for vendor risk management, and we're going to talk about how to fix that problem and get some input from folks here in the room, because I don't know all the answers. All I can do is relay what I see and what I see the problems being. So a little bit about me. I started an internet business in Pensacola, Florida back in 1996. It was one of the first web hosting companies in the United States, a company called Creative Data Concepts. It became GridSouth Networks. I merged with AppRiver. I've worked for AppRiver and Zix for about 15 years. I've been involved in InfoSec probably longer than some of you have been alive, but InfoSec wasn't a thing back then, so we just called it, hey, we were just doing sysadmin stuff, right? So, but I've spoken at quite a number of different conferences on different areas. My expertise was in DNS when I was working for AppRiver, system engineer on their security team, and then also on their spam filtering. So a little bit about my background. But what is vendor risk management? Why is it important? How many of you are involved in compliance or security and you have to do vendor risk management? Either you're a vendor and you have to provide that for your customers, or they ask it from you. Everybody, right? Pretty much everybody does that. Why do you do it? That's exactly it, right? Well, nobody knows why do we do this, right? Well, what is vendor risk management, right? It's the ongoing process of identifying, managing, and monitoring risks associated with a vendor or supplier. The problem is a lot of us are security minded, and those risks are more than just security related risks. Those risks deal with security, obviously, but they also deal with health and safety, compliance risks, reputational risks, financial risks, operational risks, things that deal with strategic movement for your business. Most organizations refer to NIST Special Publication 837 when they're looking at how to do risk management, or they look at the ISO 31000 framework for their risk management guidelines. The NIST documents are available for free. If you want to get the ISO documents, you have to subscribe to those and pay for them. So they do have a cost involved with them. But all of these different risks go into determining how a vendor is going to impact your business, or how you as a vendor are going to impact your customer's business, right? So that's why we do this. You know, everybody has a service level agreement or a master service agreement that they provide for their customers. You have an expectation of service from your vendors. And we do this risk management process to help understand where are the shortfalls and where are the things that we have to look at to make sure that our business can meet our expectations and that the customer's expectations are being met if it's the other way around. So what isn't vendor risk management? Well, it's not a, hey, you got to fill out this questionnaire thing. It's not a completed security form. It's not a security score from a particular vendor. When I'm talking about those vendors, we're going to get into, we're not going to mention one that's in the room, but his is a little bit different. His is a little bit more useful than what most of them are, but there's a number of them out there. BitSight, Security Scorecard, ISS, all of those vendors will give you a security rating based on what they see on the public internet, based on your business. We'll talk about that in a little bit going forward. Vendor risk management is not one size fits all. You cannot say, here's my process, and every vendor has to do this process come hell or high water. If you don't do it, I'm going to stomp my feet, yell and scream, and make you do it. That's not vendor risk management, right? The process has to be different. It's not checking a box. Why do a lot of people do it? You said because they ask us to. Okay, just because they ask, just because I say jump off the bridge, are you going to do it? right? I mean, that's what it comes down to, right? You have to figure out what makes sense for your business to provide for your customers and what makes sense for your customer or your vendors to provide to you. And it's not a once-a-year exercise because risk varies over time, right? Think of what just happened overseas recently, right? All of the stuff going on in Ukraine. Do you think people are waiting a year to reassess the risk with their suppliers in the Ukraine or people that are related to that? They better not be, or their business is going to be in bad shape, right? So following a compliance framework that says you have to do a vendor risk assessment every year is foolishness if you're living in a world that changes in real time, right? Many organizations do a lot of things like outsource their vendor risk management to a third party. And these third parties, in many cases, simply grab a bunch of questionnaires, throw it at you as the vendor, get you to fill it out, then they broker that data back to their client. Their client pays them a shitload of money to do that, and you did all the work for them, right? So that's one of the problems that I faced. And what I want to look at here is how do we rank risk? And this is something that a lot of people don't do effectively. They don't look at how risk is ranked, and the way we look at risk from an organizational management perspective is risks are based on two things. They're based on their current state, and then they're based on some sort of future state, so a spread. And the likelihood, what we do is we consider the likelihood that a risk will be realized, and then we look at the impact of that realization of a risk. And then we would take a chart like this and give different ratings, how much likelihood or how much impact there could be to the organization, and every risk would get a score based on that and fall somewhere in these quadrants on this risk matrix. Now the delta, looking at a risk the way it is today versus the way it is when it's mitigated, would dictate how much money you want to spend or how many controls you want to put in place to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. And I think one of the things that I like to emphasize when I talk is that people have this false sense that security is an absolute thing. It is not. All right? When I ask people how much security is enough, does anybody know the answer to that question? Just enough. The answer is just enough. And why is that? Well, that's because you don't want to spend more to secure your organization than it takes to reduce the risk to a level that's acceptable to your organization. Why would you do that? You don't do it at home. You don't have doors that have a man trap and 16 levels of facial recognition to get into the house. You could protect your house to that level. You're laughing like that's funny, but that's what we do in InfoSec. We protect things to the nth level without really assessing what the risk is to protect, right? We don't look at the risk and protect to the risk to get the risk down to a level that's acceptable to business. We try to eliminate the risk. You cannot eliminate risk. So when people in security say security is a thing, it's not. Security is relative to the risk that a business is willing to live with, and every business is willing to live with a different level of risk. So this is how we rank risk. We look at the cost of reducing a risk from its current state to its potential better state. That's a control that we would put in place, either some sort of administrative or technical control, and those come at a cost. We evaluate the cost of the risk to the business, so we know that each of these different levels, if the risk is realized, let's say it's an impact of severe. Well, maybe a severe risk has an impact of $5 million a year in revenue to your business. Okay, so to reduce that severe risk down to maybe a moderate risk, which might say, oh, it's a loss of $100,000 if that risk is realized, right? So you've got a big spread there. That difference in quantitative value dictates how much you should spend to reduce that risk to that level. And if you're going to spend more than that, then it's not worth reducing the risk to that level to the business. Does that make sense? Okay, so why did I do this talk? Well, a few years ago, I was working happily as a security engineer for AppRiver. In 2019, AppRiver got acquired by Zix Corporation, and they came in and said, you have to do all the security and compliance, you have to do a SOC 2 report, you have to do Sarbanes-Oxley audits, you have to do a PCI audit, and you've got nobody to do it. So, Jim, you're elected to help get us on that track. So I moved from my engineering department over to the IT department, worked under the CIO and worked directly with the CISO. And my goal was to bring AppRiver into the same compliance that Zix had. Well, one of the things that Zix was getting from a lot of their customers was a lot of security questionnaires, a lot of interaction with customers, making sure that we were meeting their vendor risk management needs. And what ended up happening was I was dealing with third parties that were asking me to fill out a 500 question survey. When you see the quote up there from Kendra, nothing says welcome back to work like a 500 questionnaire from a customer. How many have gotten ones like that? None? Yeah, you've gotten them, right? How many of you have like a SOC 2 report or an ISO report, right? Do you think the vendor looked at that and even cared? No, they just said, here's the questionnaire, fill it out, you do the work for us, right? So that was the kind of stuff that got me going and looking at this whole process, because it doesn't scale. When you've got 20 or 30 customers, maybe you can do it. AppRiver had 40,000 customers, and they're all starting to ask us for one-off surveys of different types from different vendors, some that they made up themselves, some that were bought from third parties, but none of them were the same. And it created a process that just didn't work. So what we ended up seeing was we were not meeting customer demands quickly enough. Salespeople were up our butt to get these things done because they want the sale, and the customer's not going to do the sale until the security questionnaires are answered. So we had them barking at us. Customers are then starting to use security scores instead of looking at overall vendor risk management, and they weren't giving us time to get these things done. We were just wasting a lot of time and not getting a lot of success with the customer. So we changed things up a bit, and I'm going to talk to you about how we did that. But first, I want to show you why a lot of people do these things. I asked the question why in the beginning. Well, this is some of the requirements. Why do people do these vendor risk management assessments anyway? They're typically required for SOC 2, they're required for PCI, they're required for ISO, and also for CMMC compliance, which follows a government standard there. You have to have some sort of vendor risk management in place to be able to validate that you're actually vetting your vendors and keeping them at a certain standard. And what the problem is, these need to be scoped by the business that's doing the assessment. So it depends on the type of business that you're running. It depends on the type of business that your vendor runs, what they're supplying to you, what kind of access they have to data, what kind of access they have to your infrastructure. There's a lot of questions that go into this. I'll set this up here so I can reach it easier. And if you look at, for example, SOC 2 requirements, this is just a couple of them that have a requirement to do vendor risk assessments. And when you're looking at the SOC 2 criteria, if you see the CC, that's called the common criteria. So that's required for all SOC 2 reports. In a SOC 2 framework, there's 5 trust principles that you can do an audit on. Security is required, and you can pick any one of the other 4. In this case, the privacy trust principle also has a requirement for some additional commitments from your vendors. So these are required for SOC 2 in order to pass a SOC 2 audit. ISO 27001 has similar but more restrictive requirements. They're more general because ISO certification is built for any kind of business. It's not built for just a tech business. It's built for any type of business, manufacturing, service, whatever. So you have to do a lot of interpretation. And if you look through the clauses that are in the ISO 27002 series, this is just one of about 7 of them that are in there, and it tells you the different things that are required as part of an ongoing vendor risk management program. And a lot of them you wouldn't even think of doing, right? Some of them deal with legal regulations, making sure that your vendors are following what their legal requirements are. What other third parties do your vendors use? Do they use outside contractors, right? And a lot of you might be in the government space, and sometimes you're not allowed to do business with a vendor that uses contractors that are outside, that are not U.S. citizens, right? There's some requirements for those kinds of things. So you have to be careful about that when you're doing your reviews. So let's talk about a few real-world stories here. I want to relate some of the experiences that we had when I was working at Zix and when I ended up inheriting the CISO's responsibilities at that company. Part of my duties, like I said earlier, involved dealing with customer requests and for security data about the company and the services that we were providing. And I quickly learned that the current processes did not scale. Our customers were sending us proprietary questionnaires, hiring third-party organizations like Archer and other things to sending us a form, log in, do this thing. And some weeks I would get 5, 10, 15 of these things. Now keep in mind, we already had a SOC 2 Type 2 report, a SOC 3 certificate, which is a SOC 3 certificate just says you have a SOC 2 report and we're not giving you the whole report. They're kind of useless. We also had an ISO certification and a PCI AOC for a service provider organization from an outside auditor. So it's key, it's an outside auditor, somebody that's already attested to the fact that we did all of these things. We would lead with these documents and we still receive requests, and typically these requests will take 1 to 2 days minimum to complete per customer, and that just did not scale. We didn't have the staff to do that. So the first thing we implemented was development of a diligence kit where we took all of these documents, created a few other more detailed security documents, put them into this diligence kit, and we also provided, if you look up there, it's got a list of what was in there, but we put in what was called a gap letter or security statement. Every quarter, the CISO or myself would write all of the changes that happened across the organization that was in scope for the audit and put that into this letter. They got our pen test report, summaries, all of the things that they needed to make a reasonable assumption that we were doing the things we needed to do to protect their data. We would give this to customers, as well as had on our website a whole raft of different things about what we did from a security perspective for each of the different services so that they could look at that, and based on that knowledge, then they would have a reasonable assurance that they could do business with us. But the key thing that we did is we adjusted our master services agreement so that on our website, if you looked at our master service agreement, we told them flat out, we do not answer security questionnaires. People would demand that from us. We would point them back to the MSA and say, we don't answer them. They would pound their feet and stomp their feet and pound their fists and say, you got to answer this. And I said, why? We've given you everything that we have. And in many cases, these questionnaires would simply be a rehash of the entire SOC 2 framework, asking us exactly the same questions that are covered in that whole SOC 2 report in a much greater detail, and they were just too lazy to open the document and fill it out themselves. So we got to the point where we just wouldn't do it for them. What we ended up doing was telling them, here, you have our security documentation, and what we want you to do is we want you to fill out what you need out of your questionnaire and then schedule another meeting with us. We'll sit down with you and go over any gaps or questions that you have, and at that point, then we're done. You should have all the information you need to make sure that your assessment's done. You can prove to the auditors that you've done it, and we've given you everything that you need to make sure that you're comfortable doing business with us. And the problem that we also saw was that most businesses, once we did provide those questionnaires, they never looked at them. They get thrown in a folder, stuck somewhere. When their SOC 2 audit came up, they would throw it at the auditor. The auditor would say, oh, you did your vendor risk assessment. Great, we're done. You passed. Right? So that was a big problem, and we did not like that. They didn't like it, and it was a complete waste of time for both parties involved. And this is just a view of the table of contents of a typical SOC 2 report. This happens to be Graylog SOC 2 report from the other year. On the left is a table of contents, and you can see typically these are rather long reports, several hundred pages typically. This is a short one by most standards. And on the right, what you see is one of the common controls, and it's broken down so that you see what the control is, what the policies are that are in place or procedures, how they were tested by the auditor, and then what the results were for each of those tests. So as you can see, it's pretty detailed, and there's typically, depending on the number of trust services criteria that you look at, there's probably 300 or 400 items in a SOC 2 report that you could be evaluated on depending on the scope of the audit. So another problem we ran across is these questionnaires. We basically, again, they were the rehash of the SOC 2 framework in a spreadsheet format. Fill out the spreadsheet. What I ended up doing for most of them, it took me 5 minutes because I would put in the first answer, SOC 2 report, select all the column, Control D, close, save, email. And sooner or later, the customers learned that they needed to read our SOC 2 report because I was not going to take the time to fill out their questionnaire that was already answered in the SOC 2 report. But a lot of customers would not do that. Some of them would throw their weight around. The problem is some of these customers are very small. They might have been, I don't know, $3,000, $5,000 a year in recurring revenue. Others were really large and wanted much more attention. But at the same time, we had to build a process that scaled. And that's what we ran into, was figuring out how to do that so that we could service those 40,000 customers with the same level of presentation that we were giving to the bigger customers. Now, some customers did use something that was called a SIG or SIG Lite. I don't know if you've heard of that document. It's something that's put out by Shared Assessments. You can buy a subscription to it. It runs about $6,000 a year. But it's a spreadsheet that gives you basically a breakdown of all the security things that you could have within an organization. But it has macros in it so that you can actually, if it doesn't apply to your organization, it pulls all of those things out that don't apply, and you can provide that as a standardized format for customers. So we did fill that out, and we did do that for customers, but that's a one-time thing. You fill it out once and then give it to your customers, just like you would a SOC 2 report. And we did have a case where one of our customers, this was in the finance area, they hired a third-party risk assessment company to do a risk assessment of us. Didn't tell us they were doing this. I get an email like on a Thursday afternoon. The email comes in from this third party, and it says, here's what you're going to do for us. And it listed out, you're going to spend 40 hours in the next 8 weeks interviewing all of your internal stakeholders, so the people that run the services, the service owners within the company. You're going to provide artifacts for evidence, and you're going to do all of these things to help us provide this documentation for our customer. And I looked at this thing and I'm like, you're basically wanting us to redo an entire audit just so you can do this vendor risk management process for your customer. This thing's moving here a little bit. For your customer. So I emailed them back and I said, basically, let's schedule a meeting. We got on that meeting and they started going through their little spiel, and I said, let's hold on here a second. First, we're not doing any of that. They're like, well, why? You have to. I said, we don't have to do any of that. You're not paying for it. We don't have the resources to do it, and this customer's giving us like $6,000 a year in recurring revenue. We're going to spend more money doing this audit that you guys are forcing on us because you're doing this for this third party than we would make in a year from that customer. So we ended up going, I told them the same thing. I said, here's what I'll do. You fill out the questionnaire based on this SOC 2 report that I give you. We'll schedule a couple more meetings and I'll answer any of the gaps that you have in that process, and then you can go back to your customer and give them all the data they want. But that's all we're doing. And they're like, well, you have to do this. I said, go back to your customer. So we called the customer and I just told them, we're not doing that. And the customer goes, well, we paid this company. I said, that's not my problem. You paid a company based on what they said they were going to get done, and we didn't agree to that. We don't have a contract with you to do that, and we're not doing those things for you. So it ended up that we got through the whole process. We kept the customer. The customer was happy with what we gave them. They learned a lesson by not hiring this third party to do it for them, and everybody ended up being better off. But most people won't stand up to these third-party vendors and will just say, well, you got to do all these things. Well, you have to look at the bottom line. How does it impact your bottom line, and how is it helping your business grow versus how is it detracting from your business? And the problem with these kinds of things that we found is we want to be spending our time improving our processes, building better security, and yet we're chasing off after filling out stupid questionnaires for customers that will never look at them again in their life. So that was really an awakening moment for us. And the last thing that came up here for us was talking about a company called BitSite. We get it. And I don't want to bash the vendor, because I'll caveat this with the idea that what BitSite and what some of these companies do has value, but the way they run their business and the way they try to bring on new customers is not conducive to growing that business. They provide a very valuable service if you wish to subscribe to it. They give you a risk score, a security score, if you will, based on everything they find on the internet that's public facing. So imagine you go to Shodan, you scan the internet for IP addresses, you look at Aaron for all the IPs that are swiped to a company, RIPE, all of these different ICANN organizations that manage IP addresses. Then you go find all those resources and you run all of these different scans against them. You compile all that data and you give them a score. And that's what they're doing here. The problem is we got this from a customer. The customer said, oh, your score was, I don't know, I'll throw out a number, 750. And they wanted a score of, well, I'll use 650, and they wanted a score of 750. Well, to get to that point, we had to see the data. So we contact BitSite. Well, you can see the data, but we'll only let you see it for 30 days. After that, you have to pay for it. Okay, what's the cost? $60,000 a year to to access the data so that we can service this customer and get the score down to a level where they're going to continue to do business with us. So we got on there for the 30-day trial. We found out that all of the stuff that they had assigned to us as our company owning was not necessarily true. We found about a third of the domain names that they had associated with our company weren't even ours. They were other companies elsewhere in the country. IP addresses that had been used by our company 10 years ago that hadn't been fixed through. Yes, sir.
Is this the extortion portion of your talk?
Yes. You're perceptive. Yeah, so you hit that on the head there. But in any case, that we go through all of the inventory, found IP addresses, things that weren't even ours that were lowering our security score. So we tracked the hours it took, and it took about 200 hours for 3 members of our security team to go through all of the data that they had compiled to reduce it down to what was really ours. By then, the 30 days was gone, and now they were wanting us to subscribe to their service so we could see the data and the vulnerabilities so we could remediate them to get the score into a level where our customer would see that it was acceptable. The other problem with it is they give you a score based on the entirety of the organization. And the service that this customer was buying was a very small subsegment of that IP space that had very little public footprint, very little exposure. If you had just taken the score of that one, it would have been at the top of the level, but they didn't give you that opportunity. So then we come to find out you're allowed to go in there and set up a profile and tell them, well, which things do you want to count toward your public score and not? So the reality of it is the scores that you're seeing from BitSite are seriously massaged by the people that are getting in there and buying that data. So they're only exposing the things that they want you to see. Everything else is hidden. It's under the counter. It's behind the scenes. That doesn't matter. That doesn't impact our public services. All of those, all those old Apache servers, all that CentOS 6 crap that's running back there somewhere else, that doesn't matter. That's not important. So they only show you the score you want to see. But in our case, we weren't a customer, so we had no insight and no ability to change it. So all we could do was work on the last report we had and remediate the things. Well, the other problem was their cadence for readjusting your score is very slow. So we could go and remediate 15 things in a day, and 2 months later, they would reevaluate and or raise the score based on the changes. They wouldn't evaluate it right away. So it was a very tough situation for us, and it was a tough situation for any business that has it. So imagine BitSite has a customer, they have 20 vendors, they want all 20 vendors to have a score of 700 or better, and most of them don't. Well, now BitSite's got a way to extort 20 vendors to come on and be customers to get at their data so they can chase after this one customer that wants this score at this level. It's just not a very good situation. It's not tenable, because beyond the fact that there's BitSite, there's about 4 other providers, and they all charge about the same amount of money every year to do these things. You've got Security Scorecard, you've got ISS, and just a bit on ISS. Everybody has a credit score, right? Everybody knows what credit score is. It's developed through, I think, Michigan State or University of Michigan, and it's the standard for how people's credits rating goes. Well, that same organization is now developing what's called the ISS security score, and every company in the world is going to get one of those scores, and this company is going to be the security reporting agency for basically for the entire world. So watch out, it's coming, and it ain't cheap to get involved with it. So if you can find your ISS score and start to lower it now, I would start doing that before it gets too expensive to get in there and get at it. If you're a publicly traded company, it's even worse, because the ISS score is part of your what's called ESG rating. How many of you look at Yahoo Finance and look at stock prices and that sort of thing on there? Yeah, one of the values for most companies in there in the lower right-hand side is called an ESG rating. It's environmental, social, and governance rating. And it's a third-party attestation as to how well the company's doing in those 3 areas through a large set of criteria. And stock traders and investors and all of that use those ESG scores to determine which stocks they purchase or which funds they invest in. So if you're in a publicly traded company, that's a big deal. And the last thing we came across in this whole vendor risk management thing is, believe it or not, there's companies that will automate the security questionnaire answers that your customers are asking from you. You can pay these third-party companies money. They'll fill out the questionnaires on your behalf, send them off to your customers, and your customers will get the answers that they provide based on your input. So it's pretty bad when we've created a system that you have to hire somebody that's an outside third party to provide these answers to customers just to meet a need. It just seems completely ridiculous to me that these kinds of things happen and this is the way the process works. So how do we get to what really matters? I mean, I'll pose the question. When you're doing a vendor risk management, what matters to you in your business? There's a question to answer. I'm asking for input here.
Your potential downtime.
Okay, that's one area, yep. Anything else? Say again? Yeah, so access to data, right? What happens to the data? Or how about I use you for 5 years as a vendor and then I no longer use you. What do you do with my data after we sever that relationship, right? Or, you know, how much access do you have to our data center? How much access do you have to our customer data? How much access do you have to our source code? If you're a manufacturing company, you know, what's your lead time on the parts to fulfill my orders? What's that look like over time? Right, looking at a key performance indicator, kinds of things like that. Do these questionnaires and does the vendor risk management process address any of that? So in my mind, a lot of this vendor risk management has become a moneymaker for the vendors that offer those services, and they don't really do a great service for the companies that are supposed to be looking at real risk, right? I mean, look at what's going on now. For example, we have a small internet business and we provide internet service in a small part of downtown. We cannot buy routers. We cannot buy switches. There's nothing there. Now, how many people, if you go back and look at their vendor risk management of those vendors 3 years ago or a year ago, would have said, yeah, I worry about whether they can supply my needs? Nobody, right? They're all looking at security related things. And yet now we can't, as a business, make money because this vendor can't supply us with things that we need because they can't get the parts that they need to fulfill their orders. So it's more than just looking at, do you have routers and firewalls, and do you have, you know, do you rotate your passwords, and do you do quarterly reviews and that sort of thing? There's much more to this process, and that's my point of this whole talk, is really to get people to think about how that impacts your business short-term and long-term, and how can we get around that and get at those answers, and can you solve those problems? No. But at least you're aware if you know that this company's financial status isn't such that they could buy enough parts to fulfill the order, you might want to find another vendor, right? But are people uncovering that in these vendor risk management exercises? I would say probably not, right? So what should we be doing? How can we do it better? How can we make this process so that we can still meet the needs for compliance and yet help our business actually get some beneficial data out of the time that we put into doing these assessments? Any ideas? Russell's out, all kinds of ideas.
Well, I've seen a lot of companies now that are creating what they're calling usually a trust center. On the trust center, they will share the reports from their stock audits.
Yep.
All the logos for ISO or whoever else.
Yep.
And we've talked about this before, but something that I've tried to implement is creating that questionnaire, but having someone on my team try to find all the answers. So pull down your SOC 2 report. Look at other things you published on your trust center.
Yep.
Us to answer the question. Now that again doesn't scale.
Right.
It works if you have a reasonable amount of vendors or a large enough staff to have all your. I've been lucky at smaller organizations we could do it that way.
Yep.
But what are your thoughts on that? Have you seen others do that successfully?
Yes, in some ways, but again, it doesn't scale, right? So it goes on to the next, you segued into the next thing. There was, I don't know if anybody listens to the CISO series. David Spark and his group out in California do the CISO series every week. It's a podcast. Really good information if you're in security and compliance, if you're dealing at managerial levels. But this guy, Nick Selby, was on there. He's the Chief Security Officer at Paxos Trust, and they were talking about this very topic, right? And his statement here is really kind of confounding. It said, this is how we should be doing it. Instead, the second half, instead we have spreadsheets from hell that are created by accountants, delivered by auditors to measure cybersecurity risk. None of these people have anything to do with risk or the assessment of the risk. So what can we do to make this easier? And it can't be more than 10 questions tops. That's his take on it, right? So really what it comes down to is doing what Russell said. You provide a portal to give people access to your documentation, your SOC reports, your ISO reports. Maybe you have a SIG form that's filled out. Maybe you have a specific security document that talks about some more details about the controls about a particular service. But then you have to go and figure out how, if I'm vetting a vendor, how can I ask them the right questions that are relevant to the scope of the services that they're providing for me? And I have actually an example of that. I pulled it up on the new. I don't want to be active. Let's see, I pulled up the questionnaire that he had here. And if you look at it, it's got some basic information. Obviously, you have to know who to contact at the vendor name, that sort of thing. Then they ask, first question, what services does the vendor provide, right? I mean, obviously, if you're delivering boxes to somebody via truck, you don't have to care much about a whole lot of the security questions that vendor might be exposed to. And then they ask about, and this is specific to their type of business, they ask about what kind of encryption happens here, what kind of storage architecture, do you use VPNs, how do you handle least privilege, how do you handle static credentials, how do you handle secrets, so credentials within code, and then how do you handle your policies and your programs, do you have secure coding training, give us a little details on that. Now in this case they have a requirement for linter, which is used in code compiling. And then do you do static security scanning of your code? Do you do dependency scanning? And then he looks at a couple of questions that they have. There's really only 20 questions, but that's all they ask. And then if there's more questions, they may dive into a little bit more detail with that vendor on these things, but they're not going through that whole 200, 300 question ordeal for them. Somebody could fill this out probably in 15 minutes and get it back to them, right? And this is pretty benign and pretty easy to do. So this is where we have to go. We have to tailor the questions that we ask our vendors to what that vendor provides for us and what the risk is to the business, right? I mean, if they're providing bottled water to our business, all I care about is how do they vet their employees that are coming into my office space. That's really all I care about. If the water doesn't show up, it's not the end of the world. I can drink water out of the spigot, right? I mean, I wouldn't spend more than 5 minutes vetting that vendor. Now, if this is a vendor that's, bringing in outside consultants to work in our, PCI environment, and they're logging in and connecting remotely and doing all those sorts of things, I'm going to vet that vendor a whole lot harder. But again, one size does not fit all. So that's really the point of getting at this. The vendor risk management process has become this, hey, we're the managers of the company. You guys in IT and you guys in security and auditing have to do this thing this way. And if anybody deviates from that, then tell them to go screw off and they have to do this thing. And it's like, it just doesn't work. And we have to get to the point where we're assessing the real risk of the vendor, because I would say that we're missing a lot of the big risks. We're not covering the real risks that matter with every vendor, right? If we're spending all this time, we're just pulling the wool over our eyes, saying we're doing a process, we're doing a good thing, but when what hits the fan, somebody's going to go back and look, did you assess this vendor correctly? And you're going, ooh, maybe we should have done a little better job doing this. So that's really the point of this whole talk, and I don't have anything else as far as content here, but getting to the last slide here, how do we fix the problem? These are just thoughts, questions, thoughts. I gotta put this back on full screen because it's showing little screen. There we go. So getting at the whole idea, how do we get past just checking a box for compliance, right? That's why we do it. That's why we have to do it. But the reality is why we have to do it is because we want our businesses to prosper. We want our businesses to know what the risks are when it's operating. We want to be able to have a plan to get around those risks if something critical happens to the business. It's not about just compliance. It's about the impact and the down the road path that it has on the business. Are security scores all that matter? I would say probably not. There's more to risk than just looking at security scores. Now, again, going back, we're all in security, so that's probably top of mind, but there's a lot more to it than that. what happens with those questionnaires? What value do third-party vendors provide? Some do good work, some don't. And, Russell brought up the idea of having a portal where you can provide that information. And we use one of those at Graylog, and it works out very well. When customers ask for something, I give them a log into the portal. It provides them all of their information, and then we meet after that and go over any other questions or concerns that they have. What are the 5 to 10 key questions you can ask as a risk assessor to get at the level of sophistication of somebody's risk program or of their security program in general? How do we stop devaluating these audits? The audits that we're doing, I mean, they cost a lot of money. A SOC 2 audit, $25,000, $30,000 for a small company. That's not peanuts. It's plus the time to get the audit done. A PCI audit could cost that much or more depending on the scope of the audit. And by your customers not valuing that or not understanding what those audits mean, we're just wasting that money as well. Some vendors simply presume that businesses are going to purchase their services because they come to market. I mean, we got RSA coming up in June, right? How many of those vendors, we create something new. You got to have this thing to be able to secure your network, right? Or your business. Probably not. And how do we make these processes efficient and scalable? I mean, if you got 4 or 5 vendors, no big deal. But if you start having 40,000 customers asking you for your security posture, that's a big deal. And I think Amazon and some of those companies do it well. And I doubt that they would submit to anybody asking them a security question. They're going to go, here it is on our website. This is what you get what you get, and it's there. But they do a dang good job of putting it out there. So that's all I have. But if anybody has any questions, comments, I'm here for a few more minutes. I've got 20 minutes left, so. Back there.
So I've been in InfoSec for about 3 years, but I did 10-ish years in the ISO world before that. Worked for an organization called Innovation Body.
Okay.
So we need people who fill out and do assessments of organizations following ISO. Right?
So you're doing like pre-audit assessments to get them prepared?
Full on
Oh,
assessments.
full audits. Okay, cool.
Laboratory certifiers, inspection.
Yep.
So I guess in your case, technically 27,001, you would be doing the assessments of people who did your audits.
Okay. So you're certifying the auditors. Okay.
So coming in now, my role where I am today is doing vendor risk, vendor assessments. And it might just be my organization, the way we've recently written our assessments, questionnaires to vendors, but we dive in very, very technical most of our questions, right? It's not, tell me about protection, it's are you using one of these 3 to our standard allowable encryption types?
Yeah.
My concern on SOC 2 reports, having seen these now for 3 years, my job, the current one, as well as the ISO reports that we get one, and not just the certificates. SOC 2 audits rarely give us that answer, right? It's more of, does the service provider, the service organization do encryption? Yes, and we checked for things.
Yep.
It doesn't tell me you're using AES.
Right. Yep. I got you. Uh-huh.
For example, I just had a vendor 4 months ago, we're in 2021, still using DES1 for encryption. It's a big problem. And for us, SOC 2 doesn't have the value in many cases.
Yep.
Right? There's still a lot of our questionnaires for answers. ISO assessment reports, having seen them, given them the organization, seen what procedure, rarely are also going to answer those questions.
Yep.
Most of the time you've seen them. It's limited to, these are the things you did wrong and have to fix. Are you on a receiving end of things like that, or are you getting something a lot more full-blown from your services?
It depends on the vendor, and I guess my whole point is, the SOC 2 sets a baseline that should give you an overall assessment of the security posture so that you can spend the time asking the very questions that you're asking, right? The deeper questions, instead of making somebody go back and say, do you do these things? You've got that already covered. You've got the baseline. You've got a good, solid, here's what we do generally. Here's our policies, procedures, our governance. Now, if you have more technical questions, and that's where I was going with creating a more service-oriented security statement about a particular service. So let's say it's encrypted email. We use XYZ encryption. The data is stored in this format, the keys are stored here, here's how we do access control, getting at the meat of all of those questions that you would be concerned about, right?
Two 12 questionnaires based on impact,
Yeah. And the problem I saw with a lot of them was people would purchase something like, one of the services we offered was spam filtering. Well, they would offer, what kind of encryption do you do for spam filtering? None. It's, I mean, well, this question's not relevant, right? So the question has to be tailored to an understanding of the services, and that's where the disconnect is. The people asking the questions don't understand the technical implications of a service, so they just throw some really technical survey at somebody, and the person looking at it goes, this makes no sense from the context of the service that we're providing to you in this case.
I've seen questions like that coming in from SOC 2 auditors.
Yeah.
Not to pick on certified organizations, but folks over in our SAP, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are auditors. A lot of them come from the finance world where drilling in at certain things is great. That's what they do. Wonderful.
Yep.
But when it comes down to some of the details we need to just go beyond regular basics.
Yep.
Understanding, you know, you start off the talk with, why do we do this? Well, because the vendor has my coworkers and private health information.
Yep.
My information. My company's trade secrets.
Yep.
I need to understand how you're actually protecting that, not
Yep.
just, are you in an infantile stage, or are you sort of in that teenager or professional or maturity? I mean, SOC, I guess kind of get back to what I was getting to is, where do you see the value of SOC 2 when it comes down to trying to have this level of vendor risk assessment, maturity, burden? Is it in that middle, which is what it sounds like you're saying?
In middle to lower, and I think it just shows you that you paid attention to it and you've covered the basics. You've got the governance in place, you've addressed the security, you're concerned about those things, and now maybe the implementation of more technical controls has to have a little bit more scrutiny like what you're talking about. But if you don't even have a basic, you know, understanding of how to do the basics from a SOC 2 perspective or an ISO perspective, they're not going to have a clue about the other things. And even if they have all those technical controls in place, the business operations are going to be such a mess that I wouldn't trust them to begin with, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how encrypted the data is if they don't take care of their laptops, or if they don't take care of their governance process, or if their HR processes aren't solid. So I guess I see it as kind of a tiered approach, and that's sort of like the 5 layers of maturity, and, you know, in that, or is it repeatable? Is it, you know, all of those things? And really SOC 2 is kind of in that 1.5 to 2.5 range on that scale. That's kind of the way I see it. And most businesses that are small vendors can't afford to even get to that, right? And now you've got things like CMMC compliance that are going to come down the pike. So anybody that's doing, you know, work for government contractors going to have to do that. You're not going to have an option. You know, once they certify the auditors, it's going to come pretty quickly. So I hope I answered your question, but, and I'm not saying that's, you know, I'm not saying that SOC 2 is the only thing that matters, but it's really, it's about building the trust to a level that's here. Now we can dig into the stuff that really matters, as opposed to saying, well, do you do this thing and this thing and this thing? Well, yeah, we do all that stuff. So let's now get on to what really matters and separate us from just the basic business operations. Anything else? I appreciate your time. Looks like we're already over. I mean, we're not over. We've got 10 minutes left, but anybody have any other questions, comments, concerns?
Comment about your question, third-party management is useful.
Yep.
For a customer, I want the customer is, I've known that there are most people buying from me, coming from a large organization, a very small security team as it me.
Yep.
With a number of subsidiaries, that service was great for me to look at my own organization, not for my lenders.
Yep.
But it was much more effective than me looking at my own organization from the outside in and seeing things in one pane rather than trying to look at it and everything else in the world.
And
It was useful for that, but not for that price.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one that's better. If you go look at risk, security scorecard, it's much better detail, much better relevancy. So, yeah, but it is good for that. And if you get the value out of it, that's what matters, right?
So, going back to the beginning, we talked about the risk assessment, I guess your organization's risk tolerance. What's the best or most effective framework to use? Because I found that our organization will think that the score needs to be 7
talking about how do we relate to the vendor that they need to step up their game?
Will relate to the vendor and the business, like internal to our business, to help them understand where these risks are. But they have security, they check that box. If
Yeah.
they have encryption, they check that box.
Yeah.
But there's more to it.
That's a question that has to be answered by the people that run your company, right? They have to understand what is their risk tolerance, what are they willing to live with, what risk are they willing to take? And if you come to them and say, hey, this guy's running a server out of his basement on a cable modem with no security, not behind a firewall, and it's got our critical, PII for our employees on it, and your upper management doesn't see that as a serious risk, then I think it's a hopeless case. But you've got to train the upper management, the executives in a company, to look at risk that they own the risk and they don't know it, right? A lot of businesses, the upper level management doesn't understand that they own the risk, and there's that whole area of due diligence and due care, right? And once they're aware of it, you've done the due diligence, you found the risk. Now they know about it. If they don't exercise due care, they're negligent or could be criminally liable for anything that happens because of that. And I don't mean to say that to be like, oh, it's black and white. It's not, but it's a serious attention needs to be given to those risks that you present. How do you present them? Well, I don't have it in this slide deck, but go look up how to do a bow tie risk assessment. So you would go and find a list of risks, pick every risk, and then put it through this bow tie exercise. And it's a good way to communicate to your C-level folks what happens if a risk is realized. What are the controls we have in place now? What kinds of things could stop that risk from happening? If that risk is realized, the center of the bow tie, what does it take to recover from that risk? And then how do we measure that risk over time? Is it getting lower or higher? And we look at that over the long haul, and that's the language that they like to understand, right? They look at key performance indicators. They look at dollar values to the business, reputational risk. They don't care about technical things. If you talk to them in technical terms, the C-level folks are never going to respond to that, right? They care about dollars and reputation. So if you can convert it to that, I think you'll get some leeway in getting them to pay attention to it. How do you get your vendor to up their score? I mean, I don't know. That's for your company to decide. But in my case, I look at them and I look at we have minimum standards, and if they don't meet those standards, we'll look at the exceptions and try and figure out what it is. Is it really a big risk, or is it just some, hey, one-off? You got this company over here that's lowered your score to this level. But again, we don't look solely at those security scores either, right? We need to know that there's somebody in that company that understands that they're managing risk, they're managing security for that organization. All right, I don't have anything else. Any other questions? Good deal. Thank you.